The Russian steppe in July 1943, a landscape of endless green and gold, its rolling fields stretching to the horizon under a high and merciless summer sun. Yet beneath this serene expanse, an immense tension crackled in the air. Trenches scarred the earth, artillery pieces crouched in prepared positions, and armoured columns of tanks rumbled along the dirt roads, each movement precise, each unit poised for the moment when the quiet would erupt into chaos. This was Kursk, the largest concentration of men and machines that the Eastern Front had ever seen, and both sides knew that the coming days would be decisive. To the north, German forces under Hitler's command were assembling their spearheads. Panthers, Tigers and Ferdinands, each a mechanized fortress bristling with firepower. Pilots from the Luftwaffe circled overhead, ready to strike at the Soviet positions and soften the ground for the armoured advance. Every commander, from Model in the north to Hoth in the south, understood the stakes. After the disaster of Stalingrad, success here could restore the initiative to the Wehrmacht, potentially rolling back the Red Army and shifting the balance on the Eastern Front. On the opposite side, the Soviets were equally vigilant. Intelligence networks hummed with reports of German preparations, giving the Red Army a rare chance to anticipate the blow before it landed. Marshal Zhukov and his generals would transform the Kursk salient into a fortress. T-34s and KV-1s glinted in the sun as crews drilled, their faces set with determination. In this tense silence, the steppe itself seemed to hold its breath. Around 3 million troops, thousands of tanks and hundreds of aircraft stood ready on either side. Every decision, every moment, and every misstep would be magnified across the plains. By the 5th of July, the thunder of artillery would shatter the stillness, and one of the largest armoured confrontations in history would unfold. A titanic struggle that would shape the fate of the Eastern Front, and leave its mark on military history forever. Welcome to Wars of the World. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad in early 1943, the Wehrmacht found itself reeling. The 6th Army's surrender in February had shattered not only German military strength, but also their morale. Along the entire Eastern Front, losses in men, materiel and momentum forced the German High Command to reassess its strategy. Yet Hitler, who was convinced that Germany must regain the initiative before the summer, pressed his generals to find a path back to dominance. In the southern sectors, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein reorganized the remnants of the shattered formations into a revived army group south. By February to March, he launched a counterstroke that would come to be known as the Third Battle of Kharkov. Using the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth and the SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser, Manstein struck at the overextended Soviet spearheads after their drive west from Stalingrad. In swift, brutal maneuver warfare, these German armoured forces flanked, encircled, and then destroyed forward Soviet units, inflicting heavy casualties and recapturing the city of Kharkov on March 14, 1943. And then pushing to the north to retake Belgorod by the end of the month. That success, though tactically impressive, exposed fragility. These gains had stretched the German supply lines. their forces remaining overextended, and the spring thaw, known as the Rasputitsa, would soon make large-scale operations difficult. Moreover, while Kharkov and Belgorod provided some breathing room, they did little to alter the underlying strategic picture. The Red Army was recovering, reorganizing, and still capable of launching new offensives. In Berlin, Hitler and his staff weighed their options. The Wehrmacht had clawed back a local success at Kharkov, but the Eastern Front still threatened to unravel. At the same time, the wider war was turning against Germany. The defeat of Axis forces in North Africa in May 1943 removed a key theatre. Allied landings in Italy were imminent, and the strategic bombing campaign over the Reich was beginning to intensify. Hitler was facing mounting demands from his allies, a need to restore German prestige, and an urgent military requirement to prevent the Soviets from gaining an irreversible advantage. A decisive blow, now in the east, might smash Soviet strength in a single stroke, shorten the front, and free up divisions to use elsewhere. The Kursk salient, a massive bulge in the Soviet lines between Orel to the north and Belgorod to the south, seemed to offer that opportunity. If this area could be pinched off and the forces within destroyed, Germany might regain freedom of maneuver and the strategic initiative. Under the codename Unternehmen Citadel, or Operation Citadel, Hitler approved a double-pincer offensive. From the north, Colonel General Walter Model's 9th Army of Army Group Center would drive south from Orel. From the south, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's Army Group South, with General Hermann Hurt's 4th Panzer Army and General Werner Kempf's detachment, would push north from Belgorod. The two arms were to meet near Kursk, encircling and annihilating the Soviet forces inside. In his memoirs, Lost Victories, Manstein sums up the plan for the offensive. Quote, "Operation Citadel was intended to be a decisive blow, a hammer strike that would shatter the Soviet defenses and restore the initiative to the Wehrmacht." End quote. Their aims went far beyond a local success. In Hitler's eyes, Citadel could not only secure a shorter front, but also deliver a crushing psychological and military blow, perhaps even opening the way for a renewed advance towards Moscow from the southeast, in coordination with other forces. As historian David Glantz notes in The Battle of Kursk, quote, "Citadel was Hitler's last chance to regain the strategic initiative in the east and stave off inevitable defeat." End quote. Yet from the outset, there were doubts within the German command. Model had warned that his 9th Army was still depleted from the winter fighting and was weak in heavy weapons. Deliveries of the new Panther and Tiger tanks were behind on schedule, and shortages of both men and fuel persisted. Spring mud compounded the problem, forcing repeated delays. Originally set for early May, and then June, and finally early July. These postponements gave the Red Army precious time to prepare their defences, and left the Wehrmacht attempting its great gamble under even less favourable conditions. Operation Citadel was not just a bold stroke, but it was a risk which Hitler judged necessary in order to reverse the slide that had begun at Stalingrad. By early 1943, Stalin and the Stavka, the Russian High Command, knew that Hitler would sooner or later try to restore German fortunes in the East. Soviet intelligence, drawing on multiple sources, including spy rings operating in Switzerland and information gained through British ultra-intercepts, had begun to put together a clearer picture of just where the next German blow might fall. Though details remained contested, the exact timings, strength, and precise axes of attack, the Kursk salient emerged in Soviet minds as the most likely focal point. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, having been elevated in strategic influence since Stalingrad, pushed hard for a defensive posture that could absorb and blunt any German advance. As he warned in a letter to Stalin, dated 8th of April 1943, quote, "In the first phase, the enemy, collecting their best forces, including 13 to 15 tank divisions, and with the support of a large number of aircraft, will strike Kursk, with their Kromskom-Oral grouping from the northeast, and their Belgorod-Kharkov grouping from the southeast. I consider it inadvisable for our forces to go over to an offensive in the near future, in order to forestall the enemy. It would be better to make the enemy exhaust himself against our defences, and knock out his tanks, and then bringing up fresh reserves to go over to the general offensive, which would finally finish off his main force." End quote. Under this guidance, the Soviet High Command assigned Rokossovsky to the central front, the north face of the salient, and Vatutin to the Voronezh front, the southern face. Meanwhile, the steppe front, with Ivan Konev, was held in strategic reserve further to the east, ready to respond once the Germans had committed. Over the months in spring, Soviet defensive preparations became almost industrial in scale. The central and Voronezh fronts constructed 3 main defensive belts in their sectors, each subdivided into fortification zones. Behind these, 3 additional belts were prepared as fallback positions. The combined depth of the 3 primary belts measured around 40 kilometers. The full system of 6 belts on both sides of Kursk stretched between 130 to 150 kilometers deep, with still more defences being held by the steppe front beyond that, giving a total defensive depth approaching 300 kilometers in some reckonings. The engineering work was immense. Soviet combat engineers and vast numbers of civilians, some 300,000 labourers by summer 1943, dug trenches, built anti-tank ditches, erected barbed wire entanglements, and camouflage nests for machine guns. Minefields proliferated. Over 500,000 anti-tank mines and some 440,000 anti-personnel mines were laid across the salient, with the highest densities being within the first defensive belt. Some of these minefields had densities of around 1,500 anti-tank mines and around 1,700 anti-personnel mines per each kilometre. Just for reference, this means that for every 60 centimetres, or about 2 feet of travel, you are almost guaranteed to stand on a mine. Defensive strongpoints were built around likely avenues of attack. Each strongpoint typically included multiple anti-tank guns, light arms, bunkers, and mortars. Many dug-in armoured vehicles and self-propelled guns were used to reinforce fixed defences. The Soviets also deployed mobile obstacle detachments, specialist engineer units whose job was to lay mines and obstacles in the path of German armoured formations, acting as flexible anti-tank reserves at division, corps, and front levels. The Stavka also stockpiled operational reserves, ready for a counterattack. Once the German offensive lost its momentum, Soviet forces under Rokossovsky, Vatutin, and later Konev would be able to launch riposte operations. Stalin, Zhukov, and the Soviet command had decided they would not preempt the German strike with a full offensive. Rather, they would let the Germans come, channel them into prepared defences, bleed them, and then lead into a counterattack. All of this turned Kursk into far more than just a salient. For the Soviets, it was being shaped into a fortress, into a trap. When the Germans struck in July, they would find themselves not merely needing to break through the lines, but also a labyrinth of prepared defences, minefields, reserves, and Russian forces lying in wait, ready for their moment to fight back. On the morning of July 5th, 1943, the vast, flat plains of the Kursk salient shook under the first rumblings of Operation Citadel. Before any tanks rolled in, the Germans unleashed a ferocious artillery barrage, pounding Soviet forward positions for nearly an hour and a half in the north and an hour in the south. The thunder of thousands of shells was soon accompanied by the roar of Luftwaffe bombers, which struck at defensive positions and Soviet airfields, seeking to soften resistance and gain control of the skies. Then, the armoured spearheads moved forward. At the centre of the German offensive were their most powerful weapons: the Tiger, the Panther, and the Ferdinand tanks. The Tiger I was a hulking presence. Its thick armour and 88mm gun were capable of destroying Soviet tanks at long range. Its frontal armour could exceed 100mm, and it weighed over 50 tons, a metal fortress that few Soviet weapons could touch head-on. The Panther, though new and still untested, combined speed with a deadly 75mm high-velocity gun, and its sloped frontal armour gave it better protection than previous German tanks. Last and certainly not least was the Ferdinand, later known as the Elephant, a true behemoth of the battlefield. Weighing 65 tons and armed with an 88mm cannon, its armour was nearly 200mm thick in places. A single hit from most Soviet guns could do little more than bounce off. The trade-off was that the Ferdinand was heavy and slow, its mobility limited to around 30 km an hour or just under 19 miles an hour, and like all machines, it was vulnerable to mechanical breakdown. In the northern sector, Colonel General Walter Model's 9th Army began its push south from around Orel. Model's men faced immediate obstacles: deep minefields, reinforced anti-tank positions, and well-prepared Soviet defensive belts. Despite artillery support and aerial bombardments, the advance ground to a near halt as Soviet counterattacks struck at their flanks. Progress was measured in mere kilometers, and Model's forces found themselves struggling against defenses that they had hoped to punch through with speed. To the south, General Hermann Hurt's 4th Panzer Army, aided by the 2nd SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser, encountered better terrain and slightly weaker forward Soviet positions. Here, the Germans could move faster, and the heavy tanks could demonstrate their firepower to greater effect. The southern formations included more of the Tiger and Panther tanks, along with a number of Ferdinands. Their task was to smash through the Soviet lines, break into the depth of the salient, and drive towards the town of Prokhorovka, where German planners anticipated a decisive engagement. Yet even here, the advance was not easy. Soviet defences were layered and cunningly arranged, with artillery dug in behind concealed positions. Minefields lay hidden beneath the earth, and anti-tank guns bristled from fortified positions. Still, Hurt was confident and determined, later writing about his engagement with the dug-in Russians. Quote, "The ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances is the essence of successful command." End quote. As the first week of the offensive wore on, German units in both sectors began to feel the strain. Vehicles broke down, supply lines stretched thin, and every kilometre of advance required clearing mines, neutralising dug-in Soviet guns, and pushing forward under constant fire. The southern forces managed to make deeper inroads than the north, but the pincer movement, necessary to encircle the Soviet defenders, had yet to take shape. The Red Army, carefully holding their reserves just out of reach, watched and waited, ready to counter the German thrust once their armoured formations were committed and vulnerable. By mid-July, the German offensive had achieved some local gains, but nowhere near the sweeping success that Hitler was hoping for. The northern advance had stalled almost entirely, and the southern penetration, though deeper, faced increasing resistance. The armoured behemoths of the Wehrmacht, Tigers, Panthers and Ferdinands, had proven terrifyingly effective, but they were not invincible. The stage was now set for the next monumental clash, the massive tank engagement at Prokhorovka, which would test both German technology and Soviet resilience, in what some would call the largest tank battle of the war. The lines were now drawn, the men were ready, and the plains of Kursk awaited the coming storm. On the 12th of July 1943, the vast plains near Prokhorovka became the stage for one of the most intense and debated tank battles in history. As dawn broke, the air was thick with smoke and the distant rumble of artillery. The ground trembled under the weight of thousands of tanks and armoured vehicles, each poised for the clash that would define the Battle of Kursk. The Germans, under the command of General Hermann Hoth, had committed their elite forces to this decisive engagement. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, led by General Paul Hauser, advanced with formidable might. At the heart of their assault were the mighty Tiger I tanks, behemoths that could destroy Soviet tanks at long range. The newer Panther tanks, lighter, faster, and with sloped armour, able to penetrate Soviet defences effectively. And lumbering forward with them were the Ferdinand assault guns, offering devastating firepower but with limited mobility. However, the Soviets were not unprepared. The 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by General Pavel Rotmistrov, stood ready to counter the German onslaught. Their forces included the robust T-34 medium tanks, renowned for their sloped armour and 76.2mm guns, which could challenge the German tanks when at closer ranges. The KV-1 heavy tanks, though slower and less numerous, provided formidable resistance with their thick armour and powerful armament. Additionally, the Soviet forces deployed a variety of anti-tank weapons, including the 45mm and 76.2mm anti-tank guns, designed to halt the advance of enemy armour. The battle commenced with a thunderous barrage, as German artillery and Luftwaffe bombers attempted to soften the Soviet positions. But despite these efforts, the Soviet defences held firm. As the German tanks advanced, they encountered well-prepared anti-tank positions, minefields, and entrenched infantry, which slowed their progress and inflicted significant losses. The engagement escalated into close-quarters combat, with tanks manoeuvring through the smoke-filled battlefield and firing at one another at point-blank range. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning fuel and the deafening roar of gunfire. The ground was littered with the wreckage of destroyed tanks, their hulks serving as a grim reminder of the ferocity of the battle. In the midst of the chaos, General Hoth remarked on the challenges faced by his forces. Quote, "Leadership had overcome its ever-inherent tendency for routine and its helplessness in unforeseen circumstances." End quote. This acknowledgement underscoring the adaptability required in the face of unexpected resistance and the evolving nature of the battlefield. Despite the initial German advances, the Soviet counterattacks began to take their toll. The 5th Guards Tank Army launched a series of coordinated assaults, exploiting weaknesses in the German lines and inflicting significant damage. The German forces, stretched thin and facing mounting losses, struggled to maintain their momentum. The Battle of Prokhorovka became instantly legendary, often described in Soviet sources as the largest tank clash in history. According to contemporary Soviet accounts, Over 1,200 tanks were said to have met on the field in a titanic engagement, a figure that amplified the perceived scale and heroism of the Red Army's resistance. These numbers were widely publicized and formed the backbone of wartime propaganda, portraying the clash as a near-apocalyptic struggle between armoured titans. Modern historians, however, have revised these figures considerably. Careful examination of both German and Soviet records suggests that the actual number of tanks that were engaged was closer to 600 to 800 on both sides. Still immense by any standard, but far less than the Soviet narrative had claimed. In the words of historian David Glantz, quote, "The Battle of Prokhorovka was not the largest tank battle on a single day in history. It did not mark the death ride of Germany's panzer forces, nor was it a battle that potentially decided the fate of the entire war on the Eastern Front. Undoubtedly, though, it was a very significant engagement, and, for the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, a disaster." End quote. This measured assessment captures both the myth and reality of Prokhorovka. While the German army did not achieve a breakthrough, with the pincer's advance being slowed and eventually halted, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army bore the brunt of the fighting at Prokhorovka. The Soviets suffered extremely heavy losses in both men and tanks, estimates suggesting that hundreds of tanks were destroyed or disabled in a single day. Strategically, Prokhorovka contributed to the eventual Soviet counteroffensive and the failure of Citadel. But tactically, however, the German armour held together relatively well in the south, and the Soviets' heroic counterattack that followed came at a very high cost, even as it marked the beginning of a strategic turning point. Prokhorovka remains one of the most intense and iconic tank battles of the Second World War due to the intensity and scale of the combat. The close quarters nature of the fighting, combined with the deployment of some of the most formidable tanks of the war, created a spectacle of armoured warfare that has captured the imagination of both historians and enthusiasts alike. In the aftermath, the battlefield was strewn with the remains of over 500 tanks and assault guns, a testament to the ferocity of the clash. The human cost was equally staggering, with thousands of soldiers from both sides being killed, wounded, or missing. The Battle of Prokhorovka marked a turning point in the Eastern Front. The German forces, having failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough, were forced to retreat. The Soviets, having withstood the onslaught, seized the initiative and began their counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back and reclaiming their lost territory. Following the cessation of Operation Citadel, the Soviets moved swiftly from defense to offense. By mid-July 1943, the Red Army had carefully positioned its reserves, and two major counteroffensives were launched: Operation Kutuzov against the Orel salient to the north, and Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev in the south, towards Belgorod and Kharkov. Operation Kutuzov, beginning on the 12th of July, involved over 1.3 million Soviet troops, supported by thousands of artillery pieces and hundreds of tanks. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Nikolai Vatutin orchestrated the assault with the dual objectives of encircling the German 2nd Panzer Army and exploiting the weakened German northern sector after the failure of the Citadel offensive. By mid-August, Soviet forces had penetrated deep into German positions, encircling pockets of troops and forcing a German withdrawal from Orel by August 18th. Simultaneously, Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev launched on the 3rd of August in the southern sector, aiming to liberate Kharkov and eliminate the German presence in Belgorod. This offensive involved the 1st and 5th Guards Tank Armies, as well as numerous rifle divisions. The Soviets employed combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, artillery, armour and air support to exploit gaps created by German defensive overextension. By the 23rd of August, Soviet troops had liberated Kharkov, marking the final time that the city would change hands during the war, and demonstrating the increasing operational skill of the Red Army. The German response to these counteroffensives was constrained by manpower shortages, depleted armour, and overstretched supply lines. Hitler, recognizing that Operation Citadel had failed to achieve its objectives, and that the German army could not sustain prolonged engagement, officially called off Citadel on July 13, 1943. German commanders, including Manstein and Huth, attempted to stabilize the front, but their options were limited. Units that had survived the southern pincer were forced into defensive positions, often in hastily prepared trenches and behind damaged fortifications. Casualty and equipment losses were severe on both sides. Soviet sources reported approximately 430,000 casualties during Operation Kutuzov alone, including more than 112,000 killed. German losses during Citadel included roughly 200,000 men, alongside 700 tanks and 1,000 aircraft being destroyed or damaged. These figures only partially convey the human and material cost of the campaign. Soldiers endured extreme combat conditions, and entire units were rendered combat ineffective for weeks. Strategically, the end of Citadel marked a permanent shift on the Eastern Front. Germany, having lost the initiative and suffered irreplaceable losses, was compelled to adopt a defensive posture for the remainder of 1943. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had demonstrated the effectiveness of deep reserves, layered defences and operational coordination between multiple fronts. The success of Kutuzov and Polkovodets-Rumyantsev allowed the Red Army to then seize the initiative, forcing the Wehrmacht back and setting the stage for their successive offensives. This would drive German forces steadily westward, ultimately contributing to the eventual fall of Berlin in 1945. As historian David Glantz observes, while the Germans avoided a catastrophic defeat at Prokhorovka itself, the failure of Citadel and the subsequent Soviet counteroffensives decisively ended any hope of regaining strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk left a long-lasting mark on the Second World War and on the history of armoured warfare. For the first time, the Red Army had not only absorbed a major German offensive, but had also transitioned smoothly into a sustained, large-scale counter-offensive. The success of Operations Kutuzov and Polkovodets-Rumyantsev demonstrated that the Soviet Union was no longer fighting merely to survive. It was capable of planning and executing coordinated, multi-front operations, with deep reserves ready to exploit enemy weaknesses. The Red Army's growing sophistication in combined arms tactics, coordination between infantry, armour, artillery and air support, became a template for the later campaigns that would drive German forces steadily westward. For the Wehrmacht, Kursk was a psychological as well as a physical blow. The failure of Operation Citadel shattered the aura of German invincibility that had persisted since the early days of the war. Hitler's insistence on a decisive breakthrough had cost the Germans irreplaceable men, tanks and aircraft, leaving them permanently on the defensive in the east. Even their most feared panzer formations were no longer able to dictate the tempo of battle. David Glantz notes that the campaign revealed both the limits of German operational planning and the resilience of the Soviet military machine, which had learned to absorb, endure, and ultimately counter the Wehrmacht's most potent attacks. Kursk has since become a symbol of industrialized warfare and the turning point on the Eastern Front. It is remembered not only for the quote-unquote largest tank battle in history, but also for the meticulous preparation, intelligence, and sheer scale of effort on both sides. Today it stands as a testament to the challenging nature of the war, from lightning-fast strikes and rapid maneuver, to attritional, coordinated operations that combined manpower, materiel, and planning on an unprecedented scale. In military history, Kursk was more than a battle. It was an instant where the momentum of war decisively shifted, and the Red Army began its inexorable advance towards Berlin and the end of the Second World War.